Hello and welcome to this online module on assessing the value of animal health surveillance. My name is Barbara Hasler and I'm a lecturer in agri-health at the Royal Vet College and the Leverhulme Centre for Integrative Research on Agriculture and Health in London in the United Kingdom. In the past 8 years, a good part of my research has focused on the economics of surveillance. I have been involved in the European Union RISKSUR project as the leader of Work Package 1, and I have been intensely involved in the development of the surveillance evaluation tool that you will be able to access through the RISKSUR website. In this module, I provide an introduction to basic principles of economic evaluation of surveillance. If you are interested in wider evaluation aspects, I recommend that you watch the training module Evaluation of Surveillance given by Marissa Pear. Thank you for joining today, and I hope you will enjoy it. At the end of this session, I would like you to be able to identify the challenges related to the economic evaluation of surveillance, to summarize the relationship between surveillance, intervention and loss avoidance and the implication for economic analysis of surveillance, and to describe how economic evaluation techniques can be used for surveillance. Challenges resulting from trade globalization, changing food production patterns, disease emergence and climate change have resulted in a need for more effective and efficient animal health surveillance systems to avoid negative economic consequences resulting from animal disease. At the same time, many decision makers face reductions in departmental budgets. Improved animal health surveillance does not only benefit animal health and welfare, but also society as a whole by promoting public health and sustainable food supply, as well as a more efficient use of resources. Questions that I often encountered in my surveillance work are the following. Is surveillance worth it? Should we do surveillance? Where should we focus our surveillance efforts? Is my surveillance good enough? Or how can I improve my surveillance? Also, this is an important question. Who pays, who gains? Who should bear the costs of surveillance? Who benefits from surveillance? Is surveillance a public or a private good? Or also, which surveillance option is the most effective? Which surveillance option is the most cost-effective? First, I would like to introduce some definitions and basic economic principles that are relevant for the economic evaluation of surveillance. By definition, economics is about the well-being of people. It is concerned with the analysis of how people in society make decisions about the allocation of scarce resources to satisfy people's many desires. The crucial word here is scarce. Without scarcity and consequently need for people to make choices about how we use resources, there would not be a need for economics. For example, if we had unlimited resources, all animal populations could be constantly surveyed and we would not need to think about how to use the resources in the best possible way. Economic analysis helps us to determine how resources can be best distributed to meet the needs of the greatest number of people. An important concept in the economics of surveillance is the concept of value. This definition here has been elaborated by Dr. Keith Howe, and it says that value is the importance, worth or usefulness people attach to something, reflecting the judgment of what is important in life and which in economic activity determines the choices made about the use of scarce resources. Hence, value is determined by the value systems of people, and most things do have a value, even though there isn't a market price for all of them. Economic considerations of surveillance can be useful in many ways. By determining economic choice criteria when comparing benefits or outcomes of surveillance, such as production losses avoided or the ability to trade with the cost of surveillance, we can make recommendations on the efficient use of resources. Moreover, economic analyses help with the prioritization of surveillance efforts and contribute to the understanding of the system and associated human behavior, which provides important information on risk factors and disease dynamics. To do an economic assessment of surveillance, it is helpful to understand the relationship between disease and resources used for their control. In an animal production system, we use resources such as feed, water and land to produce goods and services like food, income, companionship or livelihood that are of value to people. In other words, we use resources to produce goods and services that have a value, and our resources are the means to create this value. If we introduce disease into such a system, the values on the right-hand side will be reduced, and in some instances quite drastically. This is an economic cost. To avoid these value losses, we invest into surveillance and intervention, which is another economic cost. With economic analysis, we aim to determine what the best possible balance is in terms of economic cost due to the disease and economic cost of the additional resource used, or in other words, we are interested in finding out what the value is for the money invested. By definition, surveillance provides information for decisions on interventions. The decision can be not to do anything. For example, if surveillance shows that the disease prevalence in a population is at an acceptable level. The decision can also be to implement an intervention to manage the disease. The important point here is that both surveillance and intervention are resource-using activities for disease control, and that a trade-off may exist between them. With surveillance alone, disease in a population will not be reduced or avoided, but it gives important information for successful intervention, which will ultimately lead to the avoidance of disease and associated losses. In this relationship, surveillance and intervention can be seen either as complements, which means surveillance and intervention resources will always be used in a given ratio and can be treated as one input, for example in a test and cull scenario. Or they can be substitutes, which means that using more of one input will require the use of less resources for the other. Intuitively, we tend to treat surveillance and intervention as substitutes. For example, if you think about early warning surveillance, where the expectation commonly is that early detection leads to the avoidance of larger outbreaks and hence an avoidance of outbreak control measures. We now translate this technical relationship into a value relationship. Here we are looking at the graph that depicts the marginal output losses expressed in pounds over time for two situations. The orange curve shows an outbreak of an epidemic disease in the absence of any mitigation activities. That means there is no surveillance and control. The blue curve shows what the losses over time would look like with the best available mitigation strategy, which would be our technical optimum. Looking at the situation from a vet's perspective, we would like to operate at this technical optimum. Hence, our target would be the blue curve. But if you look at it from an economic point of view, the technical optimum is rarely the best option. In economic analysis, we want to look at all the possible curves between the two extremes and find the curve where the additional combined cost of surveillance and intervention equals an additional reduction in output losses. In other words, we want to find the curve where the marginal benefits equal the marginal costs, which is where the overall economic cost of disease and control are at the lowest point and the benefits for society are maximized. To be able to identify this point, it is necessary to identify least cost combinations of surveillance and interventions. This concept is presented in this figure in a different way. Curves A1 and A2 show substitution possibilities between surveillance and intervention for two out of very many feasible levels of avoided losses. As surveillance increases, the level of intervention resources required decreases. For a given technical relationship between surveillance and intervention, the relative financial costs of prevention determine the least cost combination for any level of avoided losses. The grey lines on this chart show the initial financial cost of surveillance relative to intervention, and where the tangent touches the curves A1 and A2, we find the least cost combinations of surveillance and intervention, which would be the points J and K. If, let's say, surveillance cheapens relative to intervention for the same level of avoided losses, resources must be reallocated from intervention to surveillance, which means that for A1 we should move from J to X, and for A2 we should move from K to Y. We can now take this principle a step further and plot all least cost combinations in relation to many levels of loss avoidance, here depicted as the curves A1 to AN. If you link all these least cost points, we can identify an expansion path, which is the green curve here. The net benefit for society is maximized at the point where the marginal loss avoidance, or in other words, the marginal benefit, equals the marginal cost on this expansion path. To identify this economic optimum for disease mitigation, it is necessary to understand the technical relationships between loss avoidance and the use of surveillance and intervention resources. We also must have data to translate loss avoidance and resource use into monetary values, such as benefits and costs, then determine the least cost combinations for surveillance and intervention as explained, and finally identify the least cost combinations consistent with the avoidance loss that maximizes economic welfare. As a next step, I would like to say a few words about surveillance and intervention in the wider mitigation context. As you know, there are different surveillance objectives, and my colleagues and I have developed a classification system to illustrate the relationship between surveillance, intervention, and mitigation outcomes. In this graph, we are looking at prevalence or incidence over time. The first stage we called sustainment stage, where disease is either absent or present at an acceptable level, and the mitigation objective is to preserve this favorable situation. Surveillance here is used to early detect disease or document freedom from disease. For freedom from disease, disease occurrence is highly unlikely, and the expected status will be that of no disease, as shown in the green curve. If an outbreak occurs, as depicted in the orange curve, intervention measures are implemented to go back to the favorable situation as fast as possible. However, depending on the disease and context, this may take a prolonged time. But the important point here is that the mitigation objective is reached and the outbreak is controlled. However, in some cases, surveillance and/or intervention may fail, and an outbreak cannot be controlled and the disease becomes endemic, as shown here in the purple curve. We then get into the next mitigation stage, which we called investigation stage. Here, the mitigation aim is to better understand the epidemiology of an endemic disease and to carefully plan and assess possible strategies for its control. The grey curve here shows an endemic disease that has already been present in the sustainment stage, but did not get high priority because of its characteristics. In this stage, surveillance is used predominantly to obtain epidemiological indicators to inform effective and efficient intervention strategies. Once a decision has been taken on what mitigation approach to pursue, we move into the implementation stage, where the mitigation objective is to reduce disease in the population to a defined target using the strategies defined in the investigation stage. Surveillance is used here to inform the intervention program. Once the target is reached, a program can move again into the sustainment stage. These relationships in reality are more likely to follow a circle as shown in this graph, where over a very long time we may go through these stages multiple times, but each time with increased disease and mitigation knowledge. These relationships are important for the economic evaluation because the potential loss avoidance depends strongly on the disease mitigation